Rory McIlroy is one of the greatest swings in the game, and he has made some subtle changes that have really transformed his game in 2022. And in this video, we're going to look at those changes he's made that's allowed him to win over $30 million in 2022. So on the left is a swing from 2021, and on the right is the swing from 2022 at the British Open on one of the practice days. So first off, let's look at setup. Very subtle, but what we'll see at setup is Rory's hips are just a little bit more level on the left hand side. So can you see that line, how it's a little bit flatter than on the right, where his hips are a little bit more tilted. What that enables Rory to do is get a little bit steeper with his shoulder plane and his hip plane in the backswing, which will allow him to set the club a little bit more upright so he doesn't get stuck behind him in the downswing. So I'll clear those lines off. So that's a subtle change that he has made. And I'm going to put a line on his butt. The camera is moving a little bit, so it's not ideal, but it will give you a little bit of an idea of what he's done differently. So if we take the club back just to the club shaft is parallel to the ground. On the left, this is a habit of McIlroy's where he gets in bad positions, is that club's just in line with his hands, and sometimes he would get the club too far behind him this way. So if we look on the right hand side, his newer swing, you'll notice that club's much more outside his hands. So that club shaft is a little bit more in front of his hands and in front of the body. There's less manipulation there, which will allow him to get it up a slight touch steeper in the backswing and get him on a better plane. So let's bring it back to where his lead arm's parallel to the ground and just clear those couple of lines off. It's very subtle and the camera angles are slightly different, but on the right you'll see that shaft just stands up a little bit higher and a little bit steeper, whereas on the left that shaft's a little bit flatter, which then when he comes to the top he'll then get that club a little bit longer and a little bit more across the line. So there we go. Whereas on the right hand side you'll notice that because he's a little bit steeper, he will stop just short of parallel, and that club isn't as far across the line because his swing isn't as long. Now what that'll do is it really changes his transition. So on the right, this is really subtle, his hands work more down, whereas on the right his hands are going to come out a little bit more. It's very subtle, and I'll play this a couple of times just so you can see. So watch on the left hand side is all the swing. That hand path will just move down. These first few frames it moves down before it starts to move out. So his hands are getting really far behind his body, whereas on the right hand side they do just move down, but then they move out a lot quicker. What he is doing here is rotating his chest more and getting those hands out in front of the body, and this transition move is huge for McIlroy. On the left, this club drops, or the hand path drops down too quickly, and then he'll get stuck behind his body, whereas on the right is getting the club more, the hand path more out in front of him, so he can rotate and hit it hard with less hand manipulation, which relies less on hand-eye coordination, so he's a little bit more consistent. So we'll see this as we move into downswing. So we'll just get lead arm parallel, and you'll see here it's very subtle, but these hands are just a touch more in front of his body. It's very subtle, but if you look in relation to his chest, can you see the more over sort of the center of the chest, whereas on the left they're a little bit more towards the right hand side of the chest. Also, what's worth noting, I know the camera angles are a little bit different, but we're talking tiny details here, but you'll see the right arm is a little bit more behind his body than on the right hand side. So what we'll see is as he moves closer to impact, this will make a huge difference, and this is where you really see the difference. So let's get him a couple of frames more down, and what you'll see is that right arm is more now in front of the seam line of his t-shirt. It's more in front of his body, whereas on the left hand side, the older swing, that right arm's really far behind his body. There's quite a big gap between his forearms. Can you see that difference between the left and the right? And he's also rotated far more sort of down and around on the right hand side, whereas here he's just stuck behind it. He's got a lot more tilt, or he will have, going through, so he's going to rely a lot more on flipping his hands. This is why on the left hand side he had the left and the right miss going, where on the right, his newer swing, he can just control the ball by just turning through it. So let me move another couple of frames down, and this is where you'll notice a real difference. So I'll bring him in the same position. Apologies, the camera is not great on the right hand side, but what you'll see now is, look how much more this right arm is in front of his body. His hips have rotated a lot more and his chest have rotated a lot more, whereas on the left you can see how he's almost down. There's more tilt here through the right side. Those hips haven't cleared as much, and that club head subtly is just a little bit more behind his hands, whereas on the right it's much more in front of his body. What that enables is going to do is just turn on top of it. His right side's going to come through a lot higher, and he's not going to have to use as much hand manipulation to get the ball online. So let's bring it down to impact, and we'll see here how he moves, and he's just much more on top of the ball without using as much hand manipulation to square that club face. So you'll see here again, look how much more open the hips are. I'll clear these lines off. The hips are far more open on the right hand side, the newer swing. The chest is more open. That right shoulder's a lot higher. He's more on top of it. Whereas here, he's a little bit more backed up on it. He's not rotated his chest as much, and he's using a lot of hand manipulation to square the club face. He's stalling out his body, whereas on the right he can just turn his chest hard and get the club exit in further left. So we'll see this more on the follow through. So watch as he follows through. You'll see that club exit in a lot higher, whereas on the right hand side, I'll just bring it back a couple of frames, those hands are coming through a lot lower round the corner to the left. It's just enabling not to be as active through the hands and more passive, which enables him to be a little bit more consistent, like I said, because he's not relying on hand-eye coordination and flipping with his hands to square the club face. And you'll notice here the subtle difference in club face rotation. So if I put it here to here, very, very different position. That's because on the left hand side he's flipping that club over with his hands because it's not in as good a position as it is in downswing on the right hand side. You'll also notice subtly, look at his spikes, they're still pointing to the ground. That's because he's had to stall out his body because the club was so far behind him in this position. So he gets here, stalls out his body, flips his hands, and then he can't rotate his body through and the foot stays down. Whereas on the right, he can rotate his body through. His hips have cleared much more. So you can see those spikes. So I'll just get rid of those lines, and then you'll see it a lot in the finish because he's wrapping his arms more to the left and around his body. Look how he's got more side bend through, a little bit more tilted, and that club's really swung around his body. Real fun, full finish and almost pointing at the target. Whereas on the left, because he's stalled out and he's not got as much rotation and hung back slightly, this is where the hands just come through. He's very upright, and that doesn't look like typical Rory's finish. Look how short that club finishes here. It's not pointing at the target like he normally does. So subtle changes, but they've made a huge, huge difference to Rory's game and his consistency, which has allowed him to win over $30 million in 2022. Great season, great swing. If he keeps this swing up on the right hand side, he's going to be a real force to be reckoned with for coming year.